The flame from the lighter danced dangerously close to the electrical cable as Mateo held his breath, knowing that one wrong move would either free them or kill them all. The house's security system hummed around in the darkness, cameras tracking his every movement. But his younger brother Roberto lay chained to a radiator 3 rooms away, and their mother back in El Salvador was about to receive another video showing her sons begging for money she didn't have. The safe house they'd paid $12,000 to reach had become their prison, and the only way out led through fire and the terrible risk of discovery. 3 weeks earlier, everything had seemed perfectly planned. The Herrera brothers had saved for 2 years to afford passage to America, combining Mateo's earnings from construction work with Roberto's wages from the coffee plantation. When their cousin in Los Angeles connected them with a smuggling operation that guaranteed safe delivery to a transition house in Texas, the price seemed reasonable for the level of service promised. The coordinator, who called herself Elena, had explained every step with professional precision. Elena's operation was supposedly different from typical coyote networks. Instead of dropping migrants at random locations and abandoning them, her organization provided what she called integration services. New arrivals would spend 2 weeks in a secure facility outside Houston, receiving false identification documents, job placement assistance, and orientation to American life. The house was described as comfortable, well-supplied, and completely safe from immigration raids. The journey through Mexico had been uneventful, almost boring. They had traveled on legitimate buses with properly forged tourist visas, crossing checkpoints without incident. Elena's network had contact points at every major city, providing food, shelter, and updated travel instructions. When they finally reached the Mexican border, the crossing itself took place through a tunnel that emerged inside an abandoned warehouse on the American side. Professional, efficient, exactly as promised. The safe house exceeded their expectations at first glance. A 2-story suburban home in a quiet neighborhood, indistinguishable from surrounding properties. Elena's local coordinator, a middle-aged Mexican-American woman named Carmen, welcomed them warmly, showing them to a comfortable room with twin beds, explaining house rules with maternal authority. 8 other migrants were already in residence, all waiting for their documents and job placements to be finalized. The residents seemed content enough during initial conversations. There was a family from Honduras, parents with a teenage daughter who'd been there 10 days, 2 Guatemalan men who worked construction back home and were excited about American wage scales, a young woman from Nicaragua who hoped to reunite with her sister in Dallas. Everyone shared stories of difficult journeys and relief at finally reaching safety. The atmosphere was cautiously optimistic, but small details bothered Mateo from the beginning. The windows had heavy security bars, explained as protection against burglary. The front door required an electronic keypad code that only Carmen knew. Cell phones were collected each evening for security reasons and returned each morning. Cameras were visible in common areas, monitoring movements throughout the house. Carmen explained these measures as necessary precautions in a dangerous world. The daily routine was structured like a benevolent detention center. Breakfast at 8, followed by English lessons conducted by Carmen using outdated textbooks. Afternoon sessions covered American workplace customs, social security procedures, basic legal rights. Evening meals were communal affairs where residents discussed their plans and dreams. Lights out at 10, with Carmen locking individual room doors from the outside for everyone's protection. On the 4th night, Mateo was awakened by sounds from the basement, voices speaking Spanish, but muffled as if coming through walls or closed doors. When he mentioned this to Carmen the next morning, she claimed the neighbors sometimes had loud parties, but the voices had sounded distressed, not celebratory. Roberto had heard them too, describing words that sounded like pleading rather than partying. Their unease began growing into genuine concern. The first video request came on the 6th day. Carmen announced that the document processing required additional verification from family members. Each resident would record a brief message to relatives back home, confirming their safe arrival and requesting patience with the documentation timeline. It seemed reasonable, even thoughtful. Everyone complied willingly, grateful for the opportunity to reassure worried families. Mateo's video was simple and honest. He faced a camera in their shared room, explaining they'd arrived safely and were waiting for proper papers. He asked their mother to be patient, promising to call soon. Roberto recorded a similar message, adding details about the comfortable accommodations and helpful staff. They assumed the videos would be sent as promised, providing relief to their anxious mother in San Salvador. The second video request revealed the operation's true nature. Carmen announced that additional fees were required for expedited document processing. Families would need to send money quickly to avoid delays that might attract unwanted attention from authorities. The residents will record new messages explaining this urgent need, emphasizing the consequences of delays. Anyone refusing to cooperate would forfeit their investment and face immediate deportation. The Honduran father was the first to refuse, arguing that his family had already paid everything promised. Carmen's response was swift and terrifying. She produced a tablet showing real-time footage of his house in Tegucigalpa, including his elderly parents working in their small garden. She explained how easily accidents could happen to people living at known addresses, especially when their location was shared with certain criminal organizations that operated across borders. The video recordings became increasingly desperate. Residents were coached on specific phrases to use, amounts to request, deadline pressures to emphasize. Carmen provided detailed scripts about immigration raids, document problems, and urgent bribes needed to prevent deportation. The messages were professionally edited with time stamps and location markers that made them appear genuine and immediate. Roberto cracked first, overwhelmed by the systematic psychological pressure. During his third video recording, he broke down completely, crying real tears as he begged their mother to send $5,000 within 48 hours. Carmen seemed pleased with his authentic distress, explaining that genuine emotion made the messages more convincing to family members who might otherwise question sudden financial demands. Mateo watched his younger brother deteriorate daily. Roberto stopped eating regularly, spent hours staring at walls, flinched whenever Carmen approached. The confident young man who dreamed of American construction jobs was becoming a shadow of himself. Other residents showed similar signs of breakdown. The Nicaraguan woman had stopped speaking entirely. The Guatemalan men argued constantly among themselves. The Honduran daughter seemed to age years and days. The house's true purpose became clear through observation and overheard conversations. Carmen operated what amounted to an extortion factory, using migrants' illegal status and family connections to generate continuous income streams. The comfortable accommodations were props in an elaborate performance designed to keep victims compliant, while their relatives were systematically drained of money. Documentation and job placement were fantasies used to justify extended captivity. The basement voices grew louder and more frequent, suggesting additional people were held downstairs. Mateo began mapping the house's layout during his limited movements, noting which areas were off-limits, where Carmen spent her time, how the security system operated. If they were going to escape, he needed to understand their prison's architecture and weaknesses. The breakthrough came when Roberto suffered what appeared to be a panic attack during the fourth video recording. While Carmen focused on reviving him, Mateo noticed her leaving the security system control panel unlocked. He memorized the visible wire routing, particularly the connection between the main electrical supply and the camera monitoring network. That single moment of carelessness provided the information he'd need. Planning the escape required careful observation of Carmen's schedule and the house's security protocols. She typically retired to her second-floor office around midnight, monitoring the house remotely through her computer system. The cameras operated on motion detection after hours, but they required consistent electrical power to function. If he could disrupt the power supply without triggering fire alarms, they might have a window of opportunity. The lighter came from the kitchen, palmed during dinner preparation duties. Mateo had volunteered to help with cooking, earning Carmen's trust through apparent compliance. She even praised his attitude, suggesting he might earn early release if he continued demonstrating proper cooperation. The irony wasn't lost on him. His captor was congratulating him for behavior that masked escape planning. Roberto's condition worsened after each video recording. Their mother, they learned, had already sent $3,000 by selling her small plot of land. The money disappeared into Elena's organization without any promised progress on documentation. Instead, new demands arrived, emergency fees for legal complications, bribes to prevent raid warnings, costs for continued housing and protection. The extortion machine had unlimited appetite. The night he chose for escape, Mateo waited until Roberto's breathing indicated deep sleep. His brother had been given sedatives earlier. Carmen's response to his increasing agitation during video sessions. Working by feel in complete darkness, Mateo located the electrical junction he'd identified weeks earlier. The cable routing was exactly as observed, with the security system's power supply accessible behind a loose panel in the hallway. The flame caught the wire insulation faster than expected, filling the narrow space with acrid smoke. Mateo had hoped for a gradual power failure that might appear accidental, but the fire spread quickly along the cable run. Within seconds, alarms were screaming throughout the house. Cameras went dark, and electronic locks began failing in sequence. His careful plan had become a crisis that threatened everyone inside. Carmen's voice echoed from upstairs, shouting instructions to someone, probably Elena or other coordinators. Doors were slamming, people running, the systematic order of the blackmail operation dissolving into chaos. Mateo used the confusion to reach Roberto, finding his brother groggy but conscious. They had minutes, maybe less, before Carmen regained control or authorities arrived to investigate the fire. The basement door, previously locked and off-limits, now stood open due to the electrical failure. Against every survival instinct, Mateo felt compelled to investigate the source of those voices he'd heard for weeks. What he found in the basement redefined his understanding of their situation and the scope of Elena's organization. The captivity they'd experienced upstairs was just one level of a much larger operation. 6 people occupied a single room in the basement, chained to permanent fixtures with heavy restraints. They appear to have been there much longer than the upstairs residents, their condition suggesting weeks or months of confinement. Unlike the upstairs group, these people bore visible signs of physical abuse. Their presence indicated that Elena's operation had multiple tiers, with basement captivity reserved for those who'd exhausted their family's financial resources. Among the basement prisoners, Mateo recognized a Honduran father who'd initially refused to cooperate with video demands. His wife and daughter upstairs believed he'd been deported 2 weeks ago after failing to comply with Carmen's instructions. Instead, he'd been moved to the basement level, where his suffering could be used to motivate his family's continued payments. The systematic cruelty was breathtaking in its efficiency. The basement group begged Mateo to free them, but their chains required keys he didn't have, and the fire was spreading beyond his ability to control. Roberto was barely functional, still affected by whatever sedatives he'd been given. Taking on 6 additional people would guarantee that none of them escaped successfully. The mathematics of survival demanded terrible choices that would haunt him regardless of the outcome. Mateo made the hardest decision of his life, promising the basement prisoners he'd send help while knowing he might not survive to keep that promise. The fire had reached the main electrical panel, and the entire house was losing power in sections. Smoke filled the hallways, making navigation difficult. Carmen's voice had moved outside, probably calling Elena's organization for instructions on managing the crisis. They escaped through a kitchen window that the power failure had unlocked, dropping into the backyard as sirens approached from multiple directions. Roberto was disoriented but mobile, able to follow basic instructions. They climbed the fence separating the property from an adjacent vacant lot, putting distance between themselves and the burning BLACKMAIL center as emergency vehicles surrounded the neighborhood. The immediate escape was successful, but freedom brought new dangers. They were undocumented immigrants fleeing a crime scene, probably wanted for questioning about the fire. Their families back home would receive no more extortion videos, but they'd also receive no explanations about what had happened or whether their sons were alive. The clean break they'd hoped for had become a messy disappearance that solved some problems while creating others. Walking through suburban Houston at dawn, Mateo realized they'd traded one form of captivity for another. Elena's organization would be looking for them, possibly using the same border networks they'd originally traveled through. Law enforcement would investigate the fire and discover the blackmail operation, but probably too late to help the basement prisoners. They were free but hunted, escaped but not safe. The larger implications of their discovery were staggering. If Elena operated multiple houses like this one, dozens or hundreds of families might be trapped in ongoing extortion schemes. The basement prisoners suggested that captivity could last indefinitely, with victims moved between facilities as their financial value decreased. It was human trafficking disguised as immigration assistance, with systematic psychological torture replacing physical chains. Roberto's recovery was gradual and incomplete. The trauma of forced video recordings, combined with whatever drugs he'd been given, left him suspicious of everyone and afraid of enclosed spaces. He struggled with basic decision-making, jumping at unexpected sounds, unable to sleep without nightmares. The confident young man who dreamed of American wages had been replaced by someone damaged in ways that might never fully heal. They found temporary shelter with a cousin of their cousin, someone far enough removed from Elena's network to provide relative safety. But even this sanctuary felt precarious. How far did Elena's organization reach? Which community members might be informants? Every knock on the door, every phone call, every unexpected visitor could signal the end of their brief freedom and return to captivity. Months later, through immigrant community networks, Mateo learned that the burned house had been discovered to contain sophisticated video production equipment, detailed financial records, and evidence of extensive blackmail operations. The investigation revealed connections to similar facilities across Texas and other border states. But by the time authorities moved, Elena's organization had vanished, probably relocating to new bases with new identities. Some of the basement prisoners had been rescued from the fire, but others had disappeared during the chaos. The Honduran father was among the survivors, reunited with his family after authorities arranged their temporary legal status as witnesses in an ongoing investigation. His testimony confirmed Mateo's worst fears about the scope and systematic nature of Elena's operations. The money their mother had sent, $3,000 from selling her only valuable possession, was never recovered. It had disappeared into financial networks that spanned multiple countries and criminal organizations. She died 2 years later, still not knowing whether her sons were alive, still carrying debt from loans she'd taken to meet Elena's demands. Her sacrifice had purchased nothing but extended suffering for everyone involved. Roberto never fully recovered from his experience in the safe house. The young man who'd once been eager to work American construction jobs instead spent his days in their shared apartment, afraid to venture outside, unable to trust anyone offering help or opportunity. The psychological damage from forced video recordings and systematic manipulation had broken something that couldn't be repaired through will or time alone. Mateo found work in Houston's underground economy, always paying cash, always avoiding situations that might require documentation. The electrical skills he learned as a construction worker translated to repair jobs that asked no questions about legal status. He lived quietly, anonymously, building a life in the shadows while carrying knowledge about atrocities that continued happening to others. Sometimes he thought about returning to El Salvador, but what awaited him there? Elena's organization might still have connections in his hometown. His mother was dead, his debt remained unpaid, and his illegal departure had marked him as someone who couldn't be trusted. America had become his prison as much as his refuge, a country where he existed without truly living. The lighter he'd used to start the fire remained in his toolbox, a reminder of the night when desperate action had saved their lives while failing to save others. Sometimes he'd hold it, remembering the moment when flame met cable and changed everything. The tool that had given him freedom had also revealed horrors that would haunt him forever. Some doors, once open, could never be closed again. Years passed, but the safe house nightmare never really ended. Mateo became an informal counselor for other migrants who'd experienced similar trauma, helping them understand that blackmail operations disguised as immigration assistance were unfortunately common. His experience provided credibility when warning others about too-good-to-be-true offers, about coordinators who promised comfort and security for reasonable prices. The basement voices still echoed in his memory, especially during quiet nights when sleep wouldn't come. How many people remained chained in similar facilities? How many families continued sending money to organizations that would never deliver promised services? How many mothers sold everything they owned to fund their children's extended captivity? The mathematics of exploitation were staggering and ongoing. Elena's organization, under whatever new names and identities it operated, probably continued recruiting new victims. The model was too profitable to abandon, using migrants' illegal status and family connections to generate continuous income with minimal risk. The burned house in Houston was just one facility in a network that adapted and survived law enforcement attention through constant evolution. Roberto occasionally talked about the videos they'd been forced to record, wondering whether their mother had believed their distress messages or recognized the coercion behind their words. Had she suspected they were being held against their will? Had she chosen to send money, knowing it was extortion, hoping to buy time for rescue? The questions had no answers, only the weight of uncertainty that would never be resolved. The fire damage to the house had been extensive but reparable. Drive-by observations months later revealed new occupants, fresh paint, renovated interiors. It was possible that Elena's organization had reclaimed the property and resumed operations with improved security measures. The perfect suburban location, ideal for hiding criminal activities behind normal appearances, was too valuable to abandon permanently. Mateo's electrical work sometimes took him to similar neighborhoods, past houses that looked exactly like Elena's former facility. The architecture of American suburbs made every property potentially suspicious. Who knew what happened behind those security bars, those locked doors, those camera systems installed for protection? The comfortable facade could hide any number of ongoing atrocities that neighbors would never suspect. The community of survivors grew slowly as more people escaped or were rescued from similar operations. They shared stories that revealed the scope of blackmail-based human trafficking, the sophistication of modern extortion techniques, the way family love could be weaponized against those who felt it most deeply. Their informal network provided support and warning systems that law enforcement couldn't match. Documentation of Elena's methods became a survival manual that circulated through immigrant communities. The two perfect promises, the professional coordination, the comfortable facilities, all warning signs that distinguished blackmail operations from legitimate smuggling services. Knowledge was the only weapon available to people who couldn't rely on official protection or legal recourse. The basement prisoners he'd left behind haunted Mateo's conscience more than any other aspect of his experience. Their faces, their desperate pleas, the impossible choice between saving Roberto and attempting to free 6 people in chains. Logic said he'd made the only viable decision, but logic provided no comfort during long nights when guilt outweighed reason. Some survivors' actions, however necessary, carried permanent moral weight. Roberto began showing small signs of improvement after 2 years, but recovery was measured in tiny increments that might not reach completion in his lifetime. He could enter small rooms without panic attacks, could have brief conversations with strangers without suspecting manipulation, could sleep for several hours without waking to check for unlocked doors. Progress existed, but the damage would always remain visible. The money aspect of their ordeal continued affecting their family years later. Relatives who contributed to their mother's fundraising efforts still expected repayment of loans that had purchased only suffering. The extended family network that had supported their journey now carried debt that might take generations to resolve. Financial trauma spread like ripples through communities that could least afford additional burdens. New variations of Elena's model appeared regularly in community warnings and news reports. Blackmail centers disguised as job training facilities, detention centers masquerading as temporary shelters, safe houses that trapped residents in debt servitude schemes. The fundamental concept, using migrants' vulnerability and family connections for extended exploitation, proved endlessly adaptable to changing circumstances and law enforcement techniques. The lighter in Mateo's toolbox became a symbol of desperate action taken at desperate times. Sometimes other survivors would ask about the details of his escape, seeking hope for their own trapped relatives or inspiration for their own recovery journeys. He'd tell them about the electrical cable, the spreading fire, the chaos that created opportunity. But he'd also tell them about the voices from the basement, the people left behind, the weight of choices made in darkness. His story ended where it began, with fire and electricity, with desperate action and incomplete salvation. The safe house had burned, but its model survived in other locations with other victims. Roberto was free, but damaged. The basement prisoners had been rescued, but others had taken their places. Elena's organization had scattered but not disappeared, adapting and evolving like a virus that developed resistance to every treatment. The flame from that lighter had illuminated more than just cable insulation. It had revealed the scope of systematic cruelty that turned migration into prolonged torture, that monetized family love, that disguised captivity as care. The light had shown them both a way out and a view of horrors that would continue long after their personal escape. Some fires, once started, burned forever in memory, even when the physical flames had been extinguished years ago.